All right, guys, so in response to Roe versus Wade being overturned, we're getting some pretty cringe content. There's a debate on CNN that I'm going to get to in a little bit that we'll talk about, and there was also a heated back and forth here on Fox News between Sean Hannity and Alan Dershowitz. Now, Alan Dershowitz, everybody needs to understand, was one of Epstein's buddies, and so this is not a guy who, in virtually any respect, that we would defend. But the back and forth here on abortion is very interesting. So let's take a look and we'll talk about it.
I do think the Supreme Court should never have had to reach beyond the 15 weeks. That's what was before the Supreme Court. And everybody on this show seems to think that 15 weeks is reasonable. Senator Rubio thinks 15 weeks. The Europeans think 15 weeks. Why did the Supreme Court have to jump into this and say, we're not going to decide the case before us. We're going to ban Roe versus Wade, overrule it, and allow states to be sure, allow states to abolish abortion completely.
So let me explain this a little bit for you. So Roe versus Wade, in 1973, I believe the case was, the Supreme Court ruled, they set up what's called the trimester standard, which is, okay, in the first trimester of a pregnancy, so very early on in the pregnancy, getting an abortion is your right. You have a right to it, because there's no compelling reason for the government to get involved and basically violate your privacy by getting involved in such an intimate issue. But in Roe versus Wade, they said the second trimester, states are allowed to have some health regulations around abortion. So they can have some rules and regulations. The third trimester, if states so choose, they can ban abortion. That's like late-term abortion. Okay. Now, by the way, the overwhelming majority of abortions happen before 22 weeks, really even before 15 weeks. The overwhelming majority of abortions, 90% of them. So then you had Casey, the next case came up, I think it was in the 90s. And they changed that trimester standard a little bit because trimesters are effectively kind of made up. It is true. They are kind of made up. And they changed it to the fetal viability standard. So they tweaked it a little bit. I think it made it slightly more conservative of a standard. And so basically if you're pre-viability, it's a right. Post-viability, it can be regulated or banned. Okay. Well, this new case that came up, the 15-week case, is trying to make that standard even a little bit more conservative. So if it was like 20 weeks or 22 weeks before with the Casey standard, they're trying to make it 15 weeks. So can you ban abortion 15 weeks and beyond? That was the case that was in front of them. Now, what Dershowitz is saying is they didn't even rule on this case. They just threw out all of Roe. So the position he's espousing is the more moderate one, which is the John Roberts opinion, which Roberts was trying to convince the conservative justices to agree with him on this. And the argument for it is, number one, it is the case in front of us right now. So just rule on 15 weeks. Don't rule on all abortion, because that's not the case in front of us right now. That'd be judicial activism. That'd be overreach. But also, I think Roberts took the position he took because he cares about the institution of the court and its legitimacy. And Roberts thought, if we get rid of Roe, and we allow states to ban all abortion if they so choose, well, then the court is going to lose legitimacy in the eyes of the public. And then we have a credibility crisis. And, we're flirting with, just like previous times in American history, where the court was just ignored. They don't have an army. They don't have an enforcement mechanism. So they could say something that crosses the line, and then the president and Congress could be like, yeah, that's nice. We're not going to go ahead. We're not going to do that. And so Roberts, I think, is concerned about that, concerned about losing standing in the eyes of the American people. And so he's like, no, you could rule. Yes, I agree. In this case, 15 weeks. Yeah, you can ban abortion 15 weeks and on. I'll agree with that. But I will not agree to throw out all of Roe versus Wade and allow states to ban abortion if they want. That's what Dershowitz is talking about here.
That was judicial activism, overreaching. And Sean, you oppose judicial activism. This
is the point I've been making for a while now. This is the exact point I've been making for a while now. The idea that only the left can be judicially activist. Nonsense. This is judicial activism legislating from the bench on the right. And that's what Dershowitz is pointing out correctly.
You should join me and agree with Justice Roberts that judicial activism was at play here, and it was unnecessary
Professor,
to go beyond
I would
the
take issue with
Mississippi case.
I probably will not debate as effectively as one of your greater students, Ted Cruz, as you have said.
Debate as effectively as Ted Cruz.
On many an occasion, but rights not enumerated specifically in the Constitution, like the right to keep and to bear arms, which we discussed last night, would then go back. Then the 10th Amendment, 9th Amendment would be applicable. Would it not, Professor?
You could be right about all of that, but you wait until the right case comes up. Wait until a case comes before the Supreme Court in which a state says no abortions, and then the Supreme Court could have overruled Roe versus Wade.
So you see what Dershowitz is saying? He's not even making, like a moral argument or a policy argument with his take on abortion. He's saying, yeah, if you want to ban abortion and you want to make a constitutional argument that that's the right way to go, fine. But you have to wait until a case comes before you that says a state banned all abortions. And they didn't do that. They were judicially activists and they threw out Roe even when the case in front of them was about 15 weeks or later. It's a good point. It's very clear. It's a legal argument. He's making a legal argument here. And it's an interesting one. And this guy, Alan Dershowitz, definitely leans right. And this is what he's saying.
It was
weeks is a real
unnecessary
issue,
to do it now.
I understand.
But that's what the statute was. That's what the Mississippi statute was. That's all that was before the court. Yeah.
Greg.
Look, for 49 long years, justices of the Supreme Court, Sean, have struggled mightily to justify the decision in 1973 in Roe versus Wade. It's next to impossible to defend the indefensible. Even the late Ruth Bader Ginsburg expressed reservations about it. Why? Because there's nothing in the text or the structure or the meaning of the Constitution that gives rise to this right to privacy for an abortion. It is...
So he doesn't even like the fact that the Supreme Court interprets the Due Process Clause of the 14th Amendment as having a right to privacy. So own that. He's saying, look, I'm against a right to privacy. I don't think that's in there. Well, it doesn't literally say right to privacy, but a reasonable interpretation of the text is that's a right to privacy. And he's like, no, I don't agree with that. I don't agree with that. Wow. Now, if you want to play this game, literal semantics games, it doesn't literally say right to privacy. Okay. It doesn't say anything about semi-automatic weapons in the Second Amendment, which didn't exist back when the founders wrote it. But, sure you're in favor of that. I'm sure you'd say an assault weapons ban is unconstitutional. So, look, again, it's just, here's what they do. Here's what virtually everybody does in this debate. And some people are honest about it, some people aren't. Most aren't. They take whatever their prior held political beliefs are, and then they look for a legal rationale and justification, and a constitutional justification. But the conservatives annoy me so much, because they don't admit that's what they do. They pretend like, no, I have the one true reading of the Constitution correctly. Nonsense. It's such obvious bullshit.
Neither explicit nor is it implicit, but back in 1973,
no.
different.
It is definitely implicit. It is definitely implicit. In fact, here, let me see if I could find it. The clause in Section 1 of the 14th Amendment to the United States Constitution provides, nor shall any state deprive any person of life, liberty, or property without due process of law. So they say, you are depriving people of liberty if that early on in a pregnancy, you're saying the state can get involved and ban it. They're saying that is an arbitrary deprivation of liberty. You're taking away their liberty. The state does not have an interest at that point, that early on in the pregnancy, of intervening between a mother and her gamete/zygote/pregestation fetus. That is definitely a reasonable interpretation of those words. I would argue, I'd go way further. I would argue the words on this page right here would allow for a right to put in your body whatever sort of substance you want to put in your body. I would argue it would give you a right to gambling. It'd give you a right to prostitution. Nor shall any state deprive any person of liberty. Of liberty. So, then, what does that encompass? What does that entail? If you have a right to liberty, what falls under that umbrella? Well, then we're obviously having a political conversation and a political discussion. The difference is, we're honest about that. They're not honest about that. They pretend like, no, only my reading is the correct reading. Nonsense. Nonsense. All right, now where was I?
Supreme Court conjured up out of thin air this right to privacy. It was fundamentally wrong then. It was wrong back then.
I love that argument. I'm against the right to privacy. Okay. Okay. Gotcha, buddy.
And it's always incumbent upon the Supreme Court to re-examine cases, to right a wrong. And as I pointed out on my column on Fox News, more than 230 times the Supreme Court has reversed its own precedent. Precedents are great until they're not. And yet,
see, on this point, I will agree. I don't like the argument from the left of it's precedent. Yes. Now, it is true to say that in their hearings, when they were trying to get on the Supreme Court, they acted like, oh yeah, that's precedent and we're not going to touch it. Because they lied. They lied about what they believed about Roe versus Wade. That's a fair criticism. But I don't think the precedent argument on its own merits is a good argument. Because yeah, precedents get overturned a decent amount of the time because we think the interpretation of the Constitution is not a good one. There are many right-wing precedents I would overturn. Absolutely. Overturning Lochner was overturning a precedent, but you should have overturned Lochner. So just the whole conversation about precedent, I don't find that convincing from the right or the left. Let's just have a discussion and a debate about the words on the page and a modern day interpretation of what those words mean. So I don't think any conversation about precedent is necessarily fruitful because everybody's a hypocrite on that question. There are some precedents I would uphold. There are some precedents I would throw out. The right, it's the same thing. Some precedents they would uphold, some precedents they would throw out.
Nancy Pelosi stood there today and said it's outrageous to overturn a precedent that stood for 49 years. No, it's not outrageous at all.
Well, you
in
made
fact,
great points. Plessy versus
may
Ferguson.
Not be common, it is certain.
And that's why you don't make that argument about precedent. Because then when somebody brings up Plessy versus Ferguson, that was precedent. Should you uphold that? Should you uphold the idea that black people aren't people? No, of course not. So let's just put the whole thing about precedent to the side for a second. Let's talk about the words on the page of the Constitution and a reasonable modern day interpretation of those words. That's what we need to do. That's what we should do. And I think, if we have that discussion, if we have that conversation, we can make much better arguments about what a right to liberty means in 2022.
Done in landmark cases have been overturned by the Supreme Court.
In all those cases, the Supreme Court waited until they had an actual case before it, which raised...
Yeah. See, Dershowitz is running circles around them because he keeps coming back to the legal argument. And it's undeniable what he's saying about the legal argument.
The issue. This case, the Mississippi case, did not raise that issue. It only raised the issue of whether a 15-week ban was constitutional. It would have been much...
What does that mean? And he's like, I disagree. What does that mean? What are you disagreeing on? The case was about 15 weeks. That's what it was on. To say you disagree makes no sense. That's objectively, empirically, factually what it was. Go back and look at the case. That's what it was about. I don't agree. No, you believe you want to throw out Roe versus Wade, and you don't care about how we get there. We could have had a Supreme Court case about bicycles, and Hannity would have liked it if they said, we're overturning Roe versus Wade in this case. He would have defended that, because he's an ideologue and a hack. He doesn't care about the legal arguments, and he's working backwards from his conclusion.
Better to decide that. What's wrong with Justice Roberts' opinion?
By the way,
why was he wrong?
There is nothing wrong with being proactive and examining the basis upon which the case is being litigated, which was Casey
Guys,
and
He's right. It's called judicial activism. It's called judicial activism. That's what it is. Nice way to end this segment with this body in our face. Usually we get the squatting ass on Mediaite, or we get this. Okay. Anyway, there you guys have it. A heated exchange on Fox News. Dershowitz was definitely right from a legal perspective, and I just find the arguments from the right are so slimy and so sleazy and so underhanded, and they play hide the ball, and it's gross. Hey, y'all, do me a favor and like and subscribe. It helps out big time in the algorithm. Click the bell as well for notifications when videos drop, and watch that video on screen right now. You know you want to.